In this session, we will try to unravel M.N. Roy's political ideas, particularly his pioneering ideas on radical humanism. One always asks the question why and how a communist like Manomendranath could reject the communist philosophy and adapt something totally different, totally new, and maybe in his ideas something which is trying to present an alternative both in ideas and practice to the philosophy of communism and the practice of socialism. Before I do that, I would just read a few lines from M.N. Roy himself. When as a schoolboy of 14 I began my political life, which may end in nothing, I wanted to be free. Independence, complete and absolute, is a newfangled idea. The old-fashioned revolutionaries thought in terms of freedom. In those days we had not read Marx. We did not know about the existence of the proletariat. Still, many spent their lives in jail and went to the gallows. There was no proletariat to propel them. They were not conscious of class struggle. They did not have the dream of communism. But they had the human urge to revolt against the intolerable conditions of life. They did not know exactly how those conditions could be changed, but they tried to change them anyhow. I began my political life with that spirit, and I still draw my inspiration rather from that spirit than from 3 volumes of Capital or 300 volumes by Marx. I end the quotation. Now, that is the sum and substance of Roy's moving over from communism into something he later termed as radical humanism. In the earlier lecture, I talked about that Roy, on being dissatisfied with the course of movement conducted by the Congress party led by the Gandhi, on having failed to radicalize the congressmen around him, founded the Radical Democratic Party. And that was in 1946. And in 2 years' time almost, in 1948, Conference Radical Democratic Party, he presented the idea that the party should be dissolved and replaced by an association whose main objective would be to propagate radical humanist ideas and to take part in social service activities. With that aim in mind, he wrote Principles of Radical Democracy in 22 points, or known as 22 Thesis. And this 1948 Conference of Radical Democratic Party not just dissolved itself, but at the same time adopted Roy's 22 Theses on Principles of Radical Democracy, which go by the shorter name of Radical Humanism. Now, in these 22 Theses, Roy gives ideas on his concept of man, the importance he gives to the individual, the ideological and organizational shortcomings and failures of socialism, both as an ideology and as a system, his ideas or dreams of how to construct, how to establish a radical democracy in India, in which there would be no political parties as such. Also, his ideas on the nature of economy this India would have. And his major point about radical humanism he makes in the final or the 22nd thesis. Here he says that radicalism starts from the dictum that, quote, man is the measure of everything, or, quote, man is the root of mankind, unquote. So, Roy's radical humanism thinks about an universe whose center is man, whose center is a morally, spiritually strong, morally, spiritually educated man who seeks freedom in the fullest sense of the term, not just freedom from material want, freedom from poverty, from scarcity, from sickness, but also spiritual freedom which would elevate that individual to a higher plane and transform an individual into a human being. With that aim in mind, first of all, Roy tried to free, in his ideas on radical humanism, tried to free individuals from two kinds of control. One was the control which he found to be exercised by the political parties over individuals. And second was the control exercised by the all-powerful state over the individual in the name of the collectivity, which he found both in fascist Germany as well as in socialist Soviet Union. In both the cases, he found the individual was missing, and that individual has become just an obscure, anonymous part of the larger whole controlled by forces which are not in his or her hands. In liberal democracy, actually there are two political models to start with. In his time, a state could either adopt a liberal democratic model following the Anglo-Saxon practice, or adopt the socialist model following the Soviet practice. And actually that was the dilemma faced by the newly independent countries of the Asia, Africa and Latin America, collectively known as the Third World. Each of them had before them two models, either the bourgeois liberal democracy, parliamentary democracy or presidential democracy of the Anglo-Saxon US model, or the socialist system model as presented before them by the Soviet Union. Whatever the model, both were controlled by political parties. In the Soviet model, it was a single party, the Communist Party. In the liberal democracy, there was at least on paper a number of political parties. Now, political parties apparently work with the intention of bettering lives of the individuals. They work in the name of the individual, but through their working, they ultimately come to be controlled not by the individuals they represent, but by a small coterie of people, which elite sociologist Robert Michel has termed as the iron law of oligarchy. So ultimately, party was representing actually not the individuals or their interests, but the interests of the small section of the people who led the party, controlled the party. And this section was bent on acquiring political power, or to more specific, governmental power, through elections or through revolution. And once in power, their only objective was to stay in power. And occasionally, they paid lip service to the needs of the individuals. And in a socialist system or in a fascist system, the individual was submerged into the collective ego, either of the class, as in a socialist system, or of the nation, as in a fascist or Nazi system. So the individual could not be found anymore. And if man is the center of everything, then none of these systems can provide man with the kind of life he was aspiring to have. He might be free from material wants as in a socialist system, but not having much of political freedom. He might be having political freedom as in a liberal democracy, but none of these are actually the freedom he was wanting to have, or actually elevating him from his real status. So, radical humanist ideas of Roy talked about a society which was centered around man, whose primary objective would be, whose primary responsibility was the moral and spiritual elevation of its members through education. That is the ideational part of it. On the practical side, Roy suggested, though that does not occupy much of the space in his 22 thesis. And perhaps only in one thesis, number 18, he was specific about how or what shape should the state take under radical humanism. Now, Roy was totally against political parties. We have discussed that. He had even dissolved his own child, the Radical Democratic Party, and took up his pen against political parties and for a partyless democracy. He thought the demos took a back seat and party came to the front. So he thought about a kind of highly decentralized political system guided and directed at the grassroots level by people's political committees, totally at the grassroots level. And these people's political committees will be elected, the members will be elected on the basis of population by the people themselves, without any party affiliation. And these people's political committees at every region or area, they would ultimately form the national parliament through election from among themselves. And this national parliament would be given all the powers, and that does have some similarity with the Supreme Soviet model as we found in Soviet Union. The legislature was given the sole constitutional power in every socialist system. There is no question of separation of powers between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. No question of sharing of power in the three organs. And that place at least, in that area at least, is a clear sign of influence of the socialist model on Roy, making the national parliament to be the supreme body, to be directed and guided by people's committees at the grassroots level. The economy will be on two parallel lines, the political at the very base, people's committees, at the apex, the national parliament. Same with the economy. There will be producers' cooperatives at the ground level, at the grassroots level, akin to the people's political committees. And this producers' cooperative will ultimately form a pyramidal structure, rising with each level. And decisions will be made by these cooperatives of what to produce, how to produce, where to sell, where to procure, everything. So in that sense, neither the individual bourgeois, the individual businessman, the individual corporate chief would own the economic establishments, nor a socialist state would be in total control of the economy, as in Soviet Union or China or in any socialist state, social system, but a decentralized polity paralleled by a decentralized economy. And nowhere there's any central control in that sense of the term. Roy thought that perhaps this is the way of ensuring individual freedom. If in the political arena, the individual can choose the best among themselves to be members of the local political committees, they can choose the best among themselves to be members of the national parliament, without any idea, without any thought, without any consideration for party interest. The national parliament would ultimately compose of the best possible individuals who are committed towards preserving and enlarging individual freedom. And if in the economy there is neither corporate control nor state control, people as producers will be free. They can decide their mode of production, they can decide the commodity they would produce, and all things connected with production and exchange. And thirdly, there will be a universal system of education whose aim would be to spiritually and morally strengthen the individual. So it is radical in the sense that the entire objective was to penetrate each and every area, each and every nook and corner of the society. In that sense, it could be compared to any socialist system. It was humanist in the sense that in a socialist, or though they may not be uttered in the same breath, on the same sentence, but just for the sake of the argument, that whether be in a socialist system of the Soviet model or a fascist system of the German or Italian model, the individual took a back seat. Class or nation was the collective ego, and everything was concentrated, everything was, the total importance given to this collective entity, the collective ego. M.N. Roy, he was basically individualist. He was talking about his 14 years of age. We have just read his writings, and from which he talked about freedom. So in that sense, he was individualist, concerned with nothing other than individual freedom. And this man, though he went through an interregnum of communism, could not really accept the total dehumanized control of a very powerful Leviathan-like state. Leviathan is a term made popular by Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, and Leviathan is the imaginary representation of a huge sea monster, highly powerful, having too much strength, before which human beings felt helpless. And this Leviathan state Roy hated. And he found this Leviathan state to be in existence in either Soviet Union or in fascist Germany. He could not accept that kind of control. he will accept a centralized structure in which individuals play just their part, just as in a huge machine, the different parts play their roles, but they do not have any independence of their own. You can think of any huge machine. And this is revolting to him. The state should not take a back seat, an individual come to the forefront, like the abstract individualism of the bourgeois philosophy. Each one for himself and let devil take the hindmost. Nor the all submergence of individual into the collective ego of class or nation, but a delicate balance between needs of the individual and needs of the society. And this delicate balance perhaps Roy tried to find through teaching individuals how to maintain that balance within himself. Because after all, in M.N. Roy's universe, man was the center of the universe. And if there is this balance in the individual mind between the need for individual enrichment as well as the equally important need for collective or the improvement of collective life, only then perhaps in entirety a society can progress, keeping both the interests of the individual and the interests of society in mind, not submerging each into the other, neither the individual nor the state in control of the other, neither the individual or the state taking a back seat. And this was Roy's ideas known as radical humanism, which tried to present an alternative to the bourgeois insistence of an abstract individual and the Marxist insistence on the all-powerful state and the all-powerful class. And that is the originality of M.N. Roy's thinking, which you can still recollect today.